Welcome everyone to this exciting talk called Wild Animal Welfare Through the Lens of Population Ethics and Climate Change. So our speaker for today is Tim Campbell, who is a philosopher and research fellow at the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm and the Mimir Center for Long-Term Futures Research. His research has focused on topics in ethics related to population change, personal identity over time, whole brain emulation, and most importantly, wild animal welfare. Just before I hand it over, I wanted to mention that the presentation will be followed by a Q&A session. So if you have any questions throughout the talk, please use the SwapCard app. If you click on the event, you'll see a button for live discussion, and there's a question tab there where you can submit your questions. So now, without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tim.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start the talk by saying a little bit about how I became interested in the topic of wild animal welfare. So here's a bit of background. So I'm a philosopher, and I'm based at a Swedish research institute called the Institute for Future Studies in Stockholm. It's an independent interdisciplinary research institute focused mainly on future-oriented research, focusing on how we can affect future generations for better or worse. And my work there, since I'm a philosopher, has been mostly about valuing populations. So we say a population axiology is something that tells us when one population is better than another, better, worse, or equally as good as another, focusing only on the number of individuals in the population and their well-being levels. So there are different answers that philosophers give to this question. So you can say that one population is better than another just in case it has a higher average well-being, or you could say that one population is better than another just in case it has greater total well-being. Or you could say something else. You could have some other view that tries to give weight to both averages and totals and combine them somehow to evaluate populations. And at the Institute for Future Studies, for the last 6 years, I've been working on the implications of population, of valuing population for different climate change policies. So this is a quote from the IPCC's 5th assessment report. Should society aim to promote the total of people's well-being in the world or the average well-being or something else? So far, no consensus has emerged about the value of population. Yet climate change policies are expected to affect the size of the world's population, and different theories of value imply different conclusions about the value of these policies. There's a serious difficulty which has largely been ignored in the literature. So here's the result of the 6-year project that I was working on, exploring the implications of population, valuing population, or population axiology for climate change policy. The IPCC is basically wrong. So there's more agreement than what the IPCC suggests. It's not that philosophers don't disagree about population axiology. It's just that for different emissions pathways that the IPCC discusses, and the tools used by economists for forecasting climate damages for humans, they agree which of those pathways are better than worse than others for a wide range of different population axiologies. So while there are some interesting questions about which population axiology is correct or more plausible than others, it doesn't really seem to make a difference for policy. That was the result. So we started off with a call for a big project because it really matters how we value populations for climate policy. And then the end result is that it didn't really matter that much. But the key thing is that we weren't looking at non-human animals for this. And that's a glaring omission because I assume that sentient wild animals have well-being and that their well-being matters and climate change affects them too. So I wanted to explore further what the impacts of climate change would be on wild animal welfare specifically. So I went back to the IPCC reports, but I got stuck pretty quickly. And this is because the IPCC basically has nothing to say about animal welfare. It has a lot to say about human welfare, which is good. Here's a representative quote from the IPCC's 6th assessment report on humans. Climate change is expected to have adverse impacts on well-being, some of which will become serious enough to directly worsen mental health and increase anxiety. Now here's the IPCC on non-humans. Beginning at 1.5 degrees warming, natural adaptation faces hard limits, driving high risks of biodiversity decline. At 1.6 degrees above pre-industrial levels, more than 10% of species are projected to become endangered, increasing to more than 20% at 2.1 degrees, representing severe biodiversity risk. There's nothing here about animal welfare. It's all about biodiversity. And I think the IPCC tends to have an anthropocentric bias. Human beings care about biodiversity loss, and we care about individual human welfare. But when it comes to animals, I think there's a lot that's left to be said. So what I want to do in the talk is I first want to give, I want to present what I take to be an ideal welfarist framework for evaluating populations of wild animals. I'm a philosopher, so I like to talk about grand visions. So think of the grand vision might be, what would I need in order to build a welfare heat map for the whole world that tells me how good or badly different animal populations are doing across the globe? And then I want to talk about what I take to be some progress toward this grand vision, as well as some obstacles to getting there, and then make what I take to be some very modest suggestions about how we might inch a little bit closer. Now, EA Global conferences, one of the themes is, what can we actually do to make things better? So, how can we intervene in the world in order to improve wild animal welfare? But I have to confess that I'm really stuck on these foundational issues that I'm going to discuss. So I don't actually have a lot to say about interventions, but I am going to talk about one intervention at the end of the talk briefly, outside the area of climate change that I think there's a pretty good argument for focusing on insofar as one is concerned about promoting wild animal welfare. So first, the welfarist framework for the grand vision. What kind of stuff do we need insofar as we want to be welfarist and answer the question, how well are animals doing in terms of welfare? Well, the first thing I think we need is population size estimates. We need to talk about the number of individual animals that could be affected, for example, by climate change. Not the percentage of species, not the number of species that can be endangered, but we actually have to talk about the individuals themselves. And our population change estimates under different scenarios, like 1.5 degrees warming above pre-industrial levels or 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, have to be in terms of individuals as well. Third, we need to talk about welfare, right? If we're welfarist, we need to give lifetime welfare estimates, allowing for things like interspecies comparisons of welfare. Fourth, we need a population axiology, what I started my talk with. We need a theory that tells us when some population is better or worse than another with respect to the number and well-being levels of the individuals in the population. And then finally, I think we need some way of talking about uncertainty in all these things. This sort of thing, this welfarist framework is very, very, very hard to get. But I do think that there have been progress in some areas, and I'll talk about two of them, namely population size estimates and welfare estimates. So when it comes to population size, how many animals are there? And specifically, when it comes to the animals that either we know are sentient or we should have some reasonable confidence in the claim that they could be sentient, how many beings are we talking about? And my favorite resource for this recently is a study where the researchers weren't actually interested in the question of global population sizes for animals. They were interested in something else, namely the biomass of different plant and animal groups. But they sort of gave us population size estimates by accident for a reason I'll discuss. So when it comes to this paper, the biomass distribution on Earth by these researchers, Baron, Phillips, and Milo, we're interested in what the contribution would be of all the plants, all the bacteria, all the mollusks, and so forth to total biomass. But tucked away in their 100-page appendix, you actually find that for many of the taxonomic groups of animals that they were curious about, They derive their estimates of biomass from estimates of global population size. And let me blow this up in case people, well, it's big enough, I guess you can see it. But so basically what they did is compile all the published studies that they could find, sampling population sizes in local regions of animals. And then they applied some statistical methods to extrapolate to the rest of the globe. Now there's a lot of uncertainty in what they did involved. And for example, for some taxa of animals where they didn't have enough information about species, they would use one particular species as a representative for the others. So there's a lot of fudging sort of going on here. But I think the thing to focus on is just how many beings we're talking about here. So according to Baron, Phillips, and Milo, more than 1 sextillion beings are listed here. And I think this represents the animals either that we know are sentient or that we should at least have some credence in the proposition that they're sentient. Even the small animals like nematodes. So that's population size. Now I want to talk about welfare. I think there's been conceptual research on the question of how to assess animal welfare in recent years. And I want to focus on an EA-related research group based in San Francisco called Rethink Priorities. Some of you might have heard of them. Rethink Priorities wanted to advise donors on where they could most effectively improve welfare for farmed animals like pigs, chickens, and silkworms. And for this, they employed the concept of an animal's welfare capacity. This has two components. First, what they call welfare ranges. So this is sort of how good or bad things can be for an animal at a time, how intense their pleasures and pains could be in relation to those of humans. And second, how long the animal's life lasts. So for those of you who know a little bit about global health, this is kind of like quality-adjusted life years for measuring global health, only it's applied to the case of animals. So think, for instance, of the red box here as representing the welfare capacity of a human, and maybe the blue box is representing a non-human animal that lives longer than a human, like a sea turtle or something. The boxes then represent the different animals' welfare capacities. Now, this won't tell you how good or bad things actually are for the farmed animals. For that, you have to kind of look at the world and use some other evidence, some other indicators to tell. But it can give you a sense, according to Rethink Priorities, of how good or bad things could be for these different animals. So how did they do this? Well, this is a highly simplified version of what they did to achieve this. And I can recommend looking at their post on the EA forum entitled The Moral Weights Project for further details. Basically, first what they did was they identified some sentience proxies. These are indicators of whether an animal is sentient. So they include things like, does it have bodily awareness? Does it make motivational trade-offs? And a whole other list of proxies. Then they did the same thing for what they take to be welfare-relevant proxies, or indicators of whether an animal is doing good or badly. So, does it have anxiety-like behavior? Does it have depression-like behavior, and so forth? And then after identifying these proxies, they sat down with a bunch of experts. And they sat down with a group of experts on animal biology. And for each of the farmed animal species that they were interested in assessing, they asked questions to the experts of the form, does the animal exhibit the proxy? So in the case of sentience, where they wanted to figure out the probability that an animal was sentient, they would ask questions of the form, does animal X exhibit sentience proxy Y? And they gave these possible answers, likely yes, lean no, likely no, lean no, unknown. And then they mapped these answers onto a probability ranges, and then they aggregated the data to assign point probabilities to, for example, the silkworm being sentient, a pig being sentient, a chicken being sentient, and so forth. And then they did the same thing with the welfare proxies, only this time they assigned numerical scores to the likely yes, lean yes, unknown, likely no, and lean no answers. And then what they did is generate an overall score, a welfare score for the different animals that they then divided by the human score, assuming that a human exhibits all of these relevant welfare proxies. And then they multiplied that by their probability of sentience. And that's how they got welfare ranges. That allows them to say things like, a pig can be half as worse off. A pig's pains and pleasures are half as intense as those of a human's at a time, and so forth. And they were able to do to assess different interventions for different animals. Now, putting aside any doubts that you might have about this, or any questions that you might have, I think we can ask the question: can we take what Rethink Priorities has done and combine it with the global population size estimates that we get from Baron, Phillips, and Milo to start evaluating global populations of animals? Can we do that? And I think if you're willing to make some simplifying assumptions, then the answer is yes. So here's a toy example. I'm comparing the value of all the arthropods in the world with all the humans in the world. And I made some very simplifying assumptions. So I took Rethink Priorities' welfare range for the silkworm, a very small, very simple terrestrial arthropod. And then I treated the silkworm as a representative arthropod. Now, the silkworm is not representative of all arthropods. However, I used it as a representative partly because my initial hypothesis was that because there are so many animals, the welfare of the arthropods was just going to dwarf the welfare of all the humans, simply because there are so many of them. But I wanted to make it harder for myself to achieve that result. So I picked the silkworm, which has a very small welfare range in comparison to those of humans, silkworm being a very simple arthropod. And then I used, for the duration of life, average duration of life for the arthropods, I used the lifespan for the shortest lived arthropod, which is the mayfly. That's only 24 hours. And then I made some further assumptions that make it even harder to confirm the hypothesis that I started with. I assumed that all the humans would live for 80 years, and they would be as happy as they could be. Things would be as good for them as they could at each time in their lives, in their 80-year lives. And even with those and then finally, I assumed that things for the arthropods would be slightly negative. So they would be in, basically 1/10 of the negative part of their welfare range. One reason you might think things are negative for wild animals is, this has been emphasized by other people in the EA community, is that small animals tend to have lots of offspring that die sort of very early of starvation, and they get eaten by animals, and so forth. So if you took that assumption and applied it here, then you'd get the result that the human population would consist of about 639 billion quality-adjusted life years. But the population of arthropods would be negative 5.5 trillion qualies, which is indeed much, much larger in terms of scale. So the existence of the human population and the arthropod population would be net negative. It would be a bad thing, for example, on a totalist axiology for this population to exist. Although it wouldn't be a bad thing on averagism, because the average negative welfare of the representative arthropod is actually much less than the positive welfare on average for a human. If you changed your assumption and assumed that things for the arthropods were slightly positive, then of course you get the opposite result. The arthropods are positive 5.5 trillion qualies. And you can mess around with the parameters and get different results depending on what you think is plausible regarding how good or bad things are for the animals, the duration of their lives, etc. Now, this kind of thing is very fun to do, but now I'm going to pour cold water on all this. So I think there are some obstacles here that we face. One problem is, so I like what Rethink Priorities has done with their moral weights project, but the proxies that they use, the welfare-relevant proxies, are not quantitative. So when we ask the question, how good or bad could things be for an animal at a time, it sounds like we're asking for a quantity. How much pain, how much pleasure does it experience at a time? But the proxies used in the moral weights project were of the kind, does the animal exhibit a certain kind of behavior or not, right? Does it exhibit depression-like behavior or not? Does it exhibit pride-like behavior or not? And it's not clear that we can take a list of proxies that is just binary, either it has it or it doesn't, and use that to tell us how good or how bad things are for an animal at a time. And I'd also like to know more about how the proxies relate to pain and pleasure intensity. So I have a colleague at the Institute for Future Studies, Kareem Jabari, who has this really nice example. So imagine we can either zap a human being with a cattle prod or zap a pig with a cattle prod, right? And we want to know, how painful would it be for each of these beings? Well, when we look at the welfare indicators in the Moral Weights Project, they include things like, does the animal exhibit embarrassment-like behavior? Does it exhibit pride-like behavior? And it's not clear that whether a pig's exhibit embarrassment-like behavior is relevant to how painful it is for them to be zapped with that cattle prod. I think these are things that the Rethink Priorities would concede. And they're just doing the best that they have with the tools that they have. But I think we need to think about how we can get better proxies for welfare. Second of all, there's uncertainty about how good or bad animals' lives are in the wild. So I think many in the EA community are of the opinion that wild animal welfare is overall negative for the reasons that I gave earlier. That the animals that reproduce by having a lot of offspring kind of outnumber those that have fewer offspring, and most of the offspring die young and have bad lives. But I think there's a debate to be had. I can recommend a very, very good paper by Rachel Browning and Walter Veit called Positive Wild Animal Welfare that just came out in 2023, where they're actually looking at evidence for how good things can be for animals in the wild. And I think that's something that's been ignored a lot in the literature on wild animal suffering. And then finally, we're looking at huge population sizes. And unfortunately, there's just no population dynamics models for populations that big. If I look at a local population of sea turtles, I might be able to make predictions about, for a starting size and sex ratios, how many turtles in the population there will be 10 years later. But I can't do things like that for all the animals in the world. I have to do it locally by talking about the populations one at a time. So my very modest suggestions for how we can make progress toward building the heat map that I mentioned at the beginning is, first, I think we need quantitative welfare proxies. Now, unfortunately, there have been some that have been proposed, but it's unclear how good they are. So one thing we could use is neuron counts, right? We could ask how many neurons does a pig have, and what's the ratio of the neuron count to that of humans. Maybe we could do that for setting up welfare ranges. The problem is, though, that there's no good empirical evidence that pain or the painfulness of an experience is, reliably correlated with neuron counts. And Rethink Priorities has done an excellent critique of that. We could do something like revealed preferences, right? We can set up conditions where, the animal can choose between one type of experience or another. But the problem with that is it only gives you an ordering. It can't tell you how much of something, like how much pain or how much pleasure an animal could have. And moreover, we would lack lots of information for wild animals on this. And we can do other things like concentration of neurons, the fire rate of neurons, and so forth. But I think we just need a better welfare science. And then my second suggestion is that we need to do what Milo, Phillips, and Baron did for all the animals in the world for regional population sizes. We need to look, for example, at which populations the IPCC is concerned about and can say something about changes in those populations due to climate change, and we need to put numbers on those. So those are my modest suggestions. But I want to end by here. I'm going to throw you a curveball. I don't know how many people know that. I'm going to do something unexpected. So I said I would talk about an intervention briefly. And I think that there is one, insofar as we're interested in promoting wild animal welfare, that is worth thinking about and focusing on. And that has to do with spreading life to other planets. So this is something that certain philosophers and other researchers have talked about recently. So in the future, it's possible that human beings could colonize other worlds. And it's even possible that they could try to infect other planets with microbial life. And some philosophers are concerned that if life develops on other worlds to a state in a way that's similar to how it's evolved on Earth, then because, again, the assumption that things are bad overall for animals, we could be causing vast amounts of suffering. So I can recommend a good paper on this by Gary David O'Brien in the case for animal-inclusive long-termism in the Journal of Moral Philosophy. And I think that there's an uncertainty argument for adopting safeguards against this sort of thing. Laws prohibiting, at least in the medium term, spreading life to other worlds or taking animal life to other worlds. And here I refer to Asher Sorrell and Anders Sandberg, who have this paper, "We Should Delay Spreading Life to Other Planets." I just said that there was a lot of uncertainty about animal welfare in the wild, right? So why be in favor of safeguards against spreading life to other worlds? Well, we may not know whether wild animal welfare would be net positive or negative, but coming back to the issue of population ethics, it might be morally more important to prevent suffering lives or bad lives than it is to fail to prevent good lives. In other words, we might have morally more reason to prevent the existence of suffering beings than we do to create happy beings. And even if we disagree with that, I think we should have some confidence in it. And I suggest that it acts as a kind of tiebreaker in this scenario, echoing the arguments of Sorrell and Sandberg. And so that's it.
Thanks, Tim, for that very insightful presentation. So now we'll do a Q&A period, and it looks like there are a couple of questions that have already been submitted. So the first one is it anthropocentric to pose the welfare capacity of humans as greater than all non-human animals on individual level?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. The answer could well be yes. I mean, I think there is an assumption underlying the Moral Weights Project and maybe other projects to measure animal welfare, where there's just this assumption that like the pleasures of it that a human can achieve at a time are just greater or more intense than those of non-human animals. I think it's a great question whether or not that's true. So if you adopt the Moral Weights Project's proxies, then you would end up discounting the welfare of non-human animals at a time. But as in the example I gave earlier of like zapping a pig or a human with a cattle prod, it's really not clear why we should think that the pain that a human feels in that case would be more intense than the pain a pig feels, just because we have less evidence overall that they exhibit other welfare-relevant behavior like, pride-like behavior, or depression-like behavior, and so forth. So it might be a bit anthropocentric.
Thank you. So now, what are some other groups working on understanding wild animals' welfare status better? And are there any recent developments that give you hope?
Are there any recent developments that give me hope? On understanding specifically? I guess that's...
Yeah, on understanding wild animals' welfare status.
On understanding wild animal welfare status. I mean, the people that come to mind are just the researchers in this literature that I'm engaging with. Brian Tomasic, Rachel Browning and Walter Veit, Oscar Horta. I mean, so I can name individual researchers who are doing this. As far as organizations, I'm really not sure, but I suspect that there might actually be some represented at the job fair. You could probably find a table out there. I saw one for the Institute of Preventing Suffering or something like that. So I think you can probably find people here who are working on that topic. As far as have I seen anything that gives me hope? I don't know if I've seen a whole lot. I mean, but the fact that there are people starting to work on this and calling for a better animal welfare science, I think that in itself is something that gives me hope.
How optimistic are you about progress in the science of welfare?
Ooh, that's related to the earlier question. I'm optimistic that, as I said in my talk, I think that what the Moral Weights Project, or what Rethink Priorities has done with the Moral Weights Project is a kind of progress. Even though I have worries about it, about the methodology. I am optimistic in the claim that we will have further progress, further conceptual progress. I think now that we have a better idea that we need quantitative proxies, we know that they have something to do with neurons, but it's not simple neuron counts. We can start looking at patterns of neurons firing and so forth, and try to correlate them with behavioral outputs. That's definitely something on which progress can be made. And indeed, I think probably scientists are making progress on that as we speak. As far as whether we'll ever be completely justified in saying that, I don't know, a pig's welfare is at a time is exactly 0.4 as much as that of a human. I don't know. I'm not super optimistic that we'll ever get that level of precision, but I do think that we can develop better proxies.
Are there any non-research career paths for people interested in wild animal welfare today for the next 5 to 10-ish years?
That's a good question. So non-research, I don't know of any off the top of my head, but again, I would suggest looking at the tables at the job fair. When I saw the table on for the Prevention of Suffering Institute, I think it was called, I actually talked to the person there, and I learned a lot about the ways in which they were trying to prevent animal suffering and looking into that. I'm not really the person to ask about that. I'm mostly in the field of research, but keep looking. I mean, I may not be the right person to ask, but I think you're in the right place. I'm sure that there's somebody in your swap card that you could find to help you answer that better.
What's your take on Derek Parfit's repugnant conclusion? Yeah,
that's a great question. So that's a population ethics question. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the repugnant conclusion, but so remember at the beginning of my talk, if I could go all the way back, I mentioned that there were these different theories for valuing populations. You could look at averages, but you could also look at totals. So one criticism of totalism, I guess I can use this thing for the first time. Does it work? Yeah, right. One criticism of totalism is that it implies what Derek Parfit calls the repugnant conclusion, and that's for any population that has extremely high average welfare, just think of the best lives you can imagine. There's a better population that's sufficiently large in which everyone has a life that's only barely worth living. And the idea is that if there were enough of these beings with lives barely worth living, then the total welfare in that population would be greater than the total welfare in the smaller population in which everyone has a fantastic life. People are bothered by this result. And this is actually one common objection to totalism, and it motivates the search for something else, either averagism or some other view. Unfortunately, so what's my take on that? My take is that I think all the general answers to this question of how we should value populations are going to have some very, very implausible consequence. So for example, take averagism, right? One population is better than another just in case it has a higher average of well-being. Well, that seems to avoid the repugnant conclusion, right? So remember those populations I mentioned, right? Everyone has very high average life in the smaller population. But in the other population, the larger one, everyone has a life just barely worth living, so the average is lower. So doesn't averagism give us the right result there? Well, yes, maybe, but think about this case. Suppose we're comparing populations where everyone has a horrible life, right? And now we can compare a smaller population in which everyone has a horrible life, negative welfare, to another population in which everyone has a horrible life of the same level of horribleness, but there are vastly more of them. I think the second population is obviously worse, but averagism doesn't account for this because the two populations have the same average welfare. That's extremely implausible. And I think if you get into the details of like what views are out there in population ethics, you're going to find that most of them, if not all of them, has some devastating objection like that. So that's sort of my take.
Do you think Rethink Priorities welfare estimation would be improved simply by multiplying with another proxy for sentience intensity, consisting of, for example, neuron number, brain mass, fire count, etc.?
So I think the answer to that is probably yes. I mean, the question is, which quantitative welfare proxies should we use? Neuron count, I think there are very good reasons not to rely on that. It can't just be about the neuron count. I have millions of neurons in my stomach, right? I mean, it has to be something about what the neurons are actually doing. Another example you can think of is people who have had these hemispherectomies. You know, one half of your brain is removed, and there's no reason to think that anyone who's had a hemispherectomy suffers less, you know, when they're zapped with a cattle prod or something. But they definitely have fewer neurons. I mean, it has more to do, I think, with the functionality and what the neurons are doing. And since I'm not a scientist, I can't figure out a better quantitative proxy. But my guess is that the answer is yes, that it would be more plausible with some sort of quantitative welfare proxy having to do with neurons.
And could you say something about the forthcoming paper, Radical Agreement in Population Ethics, like a quick summary of it?
Oh, yeah. Sure. So the Radical Agreement in Population Ethics, what Dean Spears and Mark Budolfsson do in that paper is they look at three, I think it's at least 2 or 3 areas, one in climate change, one on policies that would restrict access to abortion, and then a third one that I don't remember. And they asked the question, you know, would population axiology make a difference in each of these areas? And what they demonstrate is that, I think pretty convincingly, is that at least for a plausible range of different policy options, the answer is no. So in climate change, for example, and there are different reasons for this. So in the case of climate change, one thing you might think is things would be better with respect to climate change if there were fewer people, right? That's something that some people say, because there would be fewer greenhouse gas emissions, right? But what Spears and Budolfsson do is they say, okay, so what kinds of policies are we thinking about in terms of population reduction? Let's suppose we implement a policy that reduces global fertility to replacement levels. One thing that they argue is that this isn't going to make a big difference in terms of greenhouse gas emissions if our goal is to meet the targets in the Paris Accords, right, 2100, and that's because of something called population momentum. So even if the global fertility rate were to fall to replacement levels, there's still going to be the number of young women young women and girls as a percentage of the population is still going to be greater than the percentage of older people. So as long as those groups eventually go on to have kids, even if the fertility rate is at replacement level, population is going to increase. And so they argue based on that there are better things to do than worrying about population size insofar as you're concerned about climate change. They have similar arguments for access to abortion and so forth. Sorry if that wasn't a great detail, but you're right. I mean, it is a forthcoming paper, so You can't just look it up. But I think if you look up Spears and Budolfsson, you'll find they have other papers on a similar topic. You can probably find something online from them.
Is there anything specific you recommend in terms of like improving wild animal welfare?
Yeah, so I mean, the thing I talked about at the end. So why did I mention this intervention? I mean, this might seem to be like a far out kind of thing to focus on at this point, right? I actually think that compared to other kinds of interventions that I've seen in the literature to improve wild animal suffering and wild animal welfare, this one is actually very easy to conceptualize. People have talked about things like modifying animals' genes so that they suffer less and, reintroducing them into the wild and so forth. I just don't think we know like what the upshot of doing that sort of thing would be. We don't understand biological systems well enough for that. But in the case of not spreading life to other worlds, it's just about enacting some sort of enforceable policy or law that just don't bring the animals up there. So it's actually quite easy to conceptualize relative to other things that I've seen. Interventions in the wild, I think, are a tricky thing. It's difficult to intervene, I think, on behalf of a wild animal population without affecting the ecosystem in some unknown way. So that's why I chose to focus on this intervention. And as I admitted at the beginning of my talk, I am sort of stuck on the conceptual issues, which I really think are in a sense prior to the question about which interventions are best. I think oftentimes we want to leap to conclusions about, like what can we do? And sometimes we just have to learn more.
If we could end all animal suffering, for example, by stopping all animal farming, hunting, etc., do you think, based on your research, that human welfare would also be better?
So this sounds like a question about farmed animals. Can you read the question again?
Yeah. If we could end all animal suffering, where is it? It moved. If we could end all animal suffering, do you think, based on your research, that human welfare would also be better?
Oh, okay, so you skipped the...
Well, it was like, those are examples.
But
animal farming, hunting.
Animal farming, hunting, okay. If we could end animal suffering by outlawing factory farms, for example, or outlawing hunting, do I think that human welfare would improve based on that? I think that's an extremely hard question to answer. So what I would look at if I had to answer that question would be, for example, in cases of factory farms, what are the negative impacts on human welfare of outlawing those farms? Is that going to impact, individual farmers? How is it going to impact them? This is separate from the question, does the immense suffering on factory farms outweigh the welfare of like a few farmers? I think that's an easy question, for me at least, an easy question to answer. I think the answer is yes. But the question was, if we got rid of the suffering, would human welfare also improve? I mean, I don't have any empirical evidence for that. People, and you mentioned hunting. I mean, some people do want to hunt, right? So by outlawing hunting, you would be frustrating some people's preferences, right? By outlawing factory farming, you'd be having a negative impact on the farmers, or at least some farmers. So I suspect that there are actually going to be trade-offs between alleviating animal suffering and promoting human well-being. But that's just a guess.
Do you think it's a double standard that people care about wild animal welfare but still finance and support the meat industry where a lot of animals are tortured?
Do I find that a double standard? Yeah, it seems like a double standard to me. I mean, it's an interesting question, right? How bad is it to have a double standard in this case? this reminds me of the question, like, how bad is, what's the term when you tell someone else to not to do something, but you do it yourself? Hypocrisy, thank you. It reminds me of this debate about how bad hypocrisy is. I actually sort of think it's not that bad. You know, suppose you used to smoke and now you're trying to convince your kid not to smoke. Well, I guess that makes you a hypocrite, but so what? I mean, like, your son's well-being or your daughter's well-being probably matters more than your not being a hypocrite, right? I mean, we can ask the question, like, of people who are interested in animal welfare and in promoting animal welfare, if they go eat meat, you know, I guess presumably the thing they should do is stop eating meat, right? But what's worse, that they promote animal welfare and eat meat, or that they stop being a hypocrite by stopping promoting animal welfare and eat the meat? I think that's worse. That's not a defense of hypocrisy, it's just, you know.
Which people or institutes are best placed to make progress on science of welfare and or regional population size or change?
Ooh, yeah, that's a very difficult question. I mean, it was very, very hard for me to find anything on global population size estimates. You're asking about regional size. What I would do for that, I don't know the question about which institutes, but I think if you go, this is almost a famous paper now. It's has like thousands of citations, been picked up in the media, the biomass distribution of Earth. If you go to that paper and you go to the appendix, don't ignore the appendix. That was, what you'll find, I think, is the most comprehensive literature review on the question of how many animals of certain species there are across the world. And because these estimates are derived from regional estimates, my guess is you're going to find some answer to your question there.
And so for the last question, what's your career story?
My career story? Oh, man. That's a good question. So I got my degree in philosophy. I got a PhD in philosophy from Rutgers University. And then my first job on the job market was at the Institute for Future Studies. I've been there for 9 years. It's kind of an interesting job to have for a philosopher because it's not like a standard tenure track job, but and as I said in the beginning, the Institute is very interdisciplinary, so I'm surrounded by non-philosophers. And I guess the story is just that I keep applying for research grants and I keep getting the money. I wouldn't recommend that for somebody who I wouldn't necessarily recommend that for somebody who graduates with a PhD in philosophy. I think you're probably better off looking for something more secure, like a tenure track position. But in other ways, it's been quite rewarding. I mean, I really like being surrounded by demographers and sociologists and historians. I think there's only one historian at the Institute, actually, but people in other fields. I mean, it gives you a different perspective. It can also lead to pain. It's actually quite difficult when people from different research backgrounds get together on a certain project. They all speak different languages, and it's, I don't know. So there are good and bad things about it, but I think ultimately it's quite enriching. But yeah, that's been my story. And I guess in terms of continuing, I'm just going to try to continue with that.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim, again, for this great presentation and for answering all these questions. And if anyone has any other questions, there will be some office hours with Tim in office hour room 2, just upstairs. So feel free to follow us or join between 3:30 and 4.
Thank you for the questions. Thank you.